Well, it's nice to be with the Boston Global Forum and my friend Tuan. We're going to be discussing some issues of cybersecurity, and it's interesting to realize how new this is in one sense. While the internet goes back to the 1970s, the vulnerability of societies to cyber disruption really is only about 20 years old. If you look at a chart of connections to the internet, it increases dramatically in the late 1990s after the invention of the web. And if you were to draw a picture of it, it looks almost like a hockey stick curve where the number of participants goes up so dramatically after about 96 or 97 that you have the internet becoming a substrate connecting business and economies and societies, being used by the military and so forth. This has enormous benefits and gains to societies, but it also leads to great vulnerabilities. And the more you have an interdependence, the more you have possible vulnerability, and where there's vulnerability, there's insecurity, and that can be manipulated. It can be manipulated by criminal groups, can be manipulated by terrorists, can be manipulated by states as ways to attack each other. Certainly there's millions and millions of cyber attacks, though the word attack is very loosely used for everything from defacing a website to bringing down an electrical grid. And obviously most of the attacks have been at the lower end of that scale, though some elements of cybercrime have become very expensive, both for the companies that are victimized, but even for countries. And there's also cyber espionage and the use of cyber for theft of intellectual property, which has also been very expensive. But so far, I think you can make an argument, as Thomas Rid does in his book, Cyber War Will Not Take Place, that while we've seen cyber disruption and cyber sabotage, we haven't really seen cyber war in a major sense. There have been incidents like the denial of service attacks against Estonia, or the use of cyber as an adjunct to Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, or the alleged American attack on the Iranian centrifuges that's attributed to or used the word Stuxnet. There are a variety of things, but none of them have reached a threshold of what you would call a major cyber war. So the question that's interesting is, why hasn't this occurred? And I think the answer is because there is cyber deterrence. Deterrence does work in cyberspace, and often people say, well, cyber deterrence can't work because there's no way to be sure who launched an attack. And so the argument is sometimes made that unlike, let's say, nuclear deterrence, where if a missile lands, you probably have a pretty good idea of where the missile started, in cyber, if malware lands on a system, you really may not know where it started. It's not necessarily the last server, which is the origin of the malware or the attack. So people sometimes say that because of the difficulties of attribution, deterrence can't work because there's no return address. How do you know who to punish if you can't decide where the original attack came from? But I think that's a very narrow sense of deterrence. Deterrence actually has 4 different mechanisms. Punishment, such as we think of in terms of nuclear deterrence, is one aspect of cyber deterrence. But in addition, there's deterrence through denial. making the defenses so strong that it complicates the cost structure of the attacker and makes the attack not worthwhile. And also entanglement. The fact that sometimes when you have a high degree of interdependence, that the attacker may actually pay a price for a successful attack, in the sense that the feedbacks to their own economy may turn out to be too expensive to make the action worthwhile. And then the fourth mechanism for deterrence as a means of cybersecurity is norms and taboos, that we establish certain rules and norms which make an attack expensive in terms of a country's reputation or soft power. Now the question, I think, is how can we develop all aspects of cyber deterrence to prevent cyber war, but particularly what can we do in terms of reinforcing the norms? And there are a variety of ways of approaching these norms. It's interesting, some of the ways are what you might call multi-stakeholder ways, in which you have governments and non-governmental groups, civil society, academics, businesses, working together to try to develop norms. For example, in the so-called London process, which started with a conference in London about 5 years ago, and was carried on further in Seoul and Budapest, and then met most recently in The Hague a year ago now. It's interesting to see that the groups that were working together were not just governments, but were multi-stakeholder groups. I was intrigued that at the Hague conference last April, which I attended, that Microsoft, a company, issued a set of recommended principles or norms for reducing cyber conflict. And this was in the context of governments also being represented, and academics and civil society and so forth. So one way in which norms are being developed is in this informal process. There's also a more formal process. The United Nations has set up its group of government experts, which has been 15 states which have been meeting to discuss the development of norms for cybersecurity. And that has been surprisingly successful. There's been an agreement in the UNGGE that the laws of the United Nations and the laws of war apply in cyberspace, not just in kinetic space. And in addition to that, the group has been developing norms about putting certain actions off limits. So one of their recommendations, which was in the report they issued to the Secretary General and to the General Assembly last July, was that civilian infrastructure be off limits for cyber attack. That's interesting because they picked the idea of making certain targets off limits rather than certain weapons. One of the problems with cyber arms control is you don't know what's a weapon and what's not. The same piece of code may be used, depending on the intention of the person who uses it, may be used as a weapon or a non-weapon. And so to prohibit a type of code is very difficult. If I have a code that can wipe the contents of your phone or my phone, if I do it for a malicious intent, that's a weapon. If I do it because I've lost the phone and want to protect my data, it's not a weapon. So rather than try to prohibit certain malware, certain code, which is very hard and almost impossible to verify, the UN group of government experts said, let's say that certain targets are off limits, and in particular, civilian infrastructure should be off limits. And that makes it consistent with the international laws of armed conflict, which is supposed to represent rules in which you respect discrimination of not attacking civilians and proportionality of not having large damages that are disproportional to a military objective. What I found intriguing was that after the UNGGE developed this approach and brought forward these recommendations, that they in fact were picked up by the presidents of the United States and China, President Obama and President Xi Jinping, at their summit in September 2015. And Obama and Xi agreed to set up a study group to look at this proposition about not attacking civilian targets and peacetime. And they also recommended this to the group of 20. And in that sense, an idea that was a norm developed in this intergovernmental forum of 15 country experts is beginning to get more traction. And I think will also be something that can be discussed in the G7 meetings, and certainly been something which the Boston Global Forum has emphasized in its writings and publications. So we're at a point where I think we're seeing the beginning of norms to try to limit cyber conflict. What's interesting is if you look at this in a historical perspective, you realize it takes countries quite some time to adjust to new technologies. In the nuclear era, after nuclear weapons were discovered and used, it was really nearly 2 decades before you saw the first agreements on limitations. The Limited Test Ban Treaty was in 1963, 18 years after Nagasaki, and you found that the Non-Proliferation Treaty was 1968, which was even longer. If you draw an analogy between the development of cyber vulnerabilities and the sense of insecurity that's developed, and that starts, as I said, around 1996 or 7 or so, then we're about 2 decades now into the cyber vulnerability era. And so the fact that we are beginning to make progress on norms, even though it's insufficient, nonetheless it tracks in a sense with the chronology of how we dealt with a previously enormously disruptive and unknown technology. So cybersecurity is a field which is growing. It's growing rapidly. It's likely to grow even more as we enter an Internet of Things, in which you will have something, some estimates imagine that you may have something like 20 or 30 billion connections to the Internet in the 2020s. And that enormously expands the attack surface, its potential there. So we're going to see more of this, and I think it's time, and I applaud the Boston Global Forum for picking this as a topic to try to promote a more general understanding of norms related to cybersecurity. So let me stop there and say that I think this is an auspicious moment for our topic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Jonai. We mentioned that we have norms, international norms. We have GGE and we have G20, and Boston Global Forum developed Ethics Code of Conduct for Cyber Peace and Security, ECCC. So we recommend these norms, international norms, for G7 summit. So what do you think, how we can enforce these norms if that G7 summit accept the norms? Yeah.
Well, I think the interesting question will be to ask, why would governments accept norms? I think they would accept norms if it's in their self-interest. And if states feel that that norms limit the amount of destruction, amount of uncertainty that is now present in cyber conflict, they may be better to restrict themselves than to enter into an all-out conflict using cyber instruments. So I think the more that there's international discussion at bodies like the G7, the more you may develop a realization among states that it's in their self-interest to formulate and respect such norms.
Yes, and with a G7 summit in Japan, and this year, you think how Japan can play a role in cybersecurity and G7 summit initiative?
Well, Japan has been an important member of the GG, as well as at the technical level, as well as obviously a major player and now host of the G7. So the idea that Japan will be taking these norms seriously and putting its weight behind them to try to promote them, I think is an important step forward.
And the last question, then, the Boston Global Forum G7 Summit Initiative, we announced and we think not only G7 Summit country or larger country they can involve, and we hope small country can contribute and involve with this initiative and apply that and implement that. So what do you think? And you can advise how small country can contribute and play important role in this initiative.
Well, more and more countries are developing their cyber capacities. And in that sense, it's not enough just to have norms that apply to the G7. They have to apply to a much broader set of countries. And so getting such countries involved, I think, is important. Vietnam has been making important progress in this area, and I think there are many other countries. Iran has also developed considerable capabilities in this area.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk and inspire people in conference, the Boston Global Forum G7 Summit Initiative Conference at Harvard Faculty Club, May 9th. Thank you.
Well, I wish us well in developing these norms.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.